in the heart of an urban sprawl, where towering glass structures kissed the sky and historic cobblestone streets whispered secrets of the past, Ethan found his new beginning. A recent graduate with a degree in graphic design, he found the urban sprawl both daunting and exhilarating. The city was a bustling hub by day, but as night fell, it transformed into a quiet, almost eerie landscape, shrouded in shadows and whispers. Ethan, having secured a modest apartment in an older part of the city, was intrigued by its rich history. The streets here told stories of centuries past, each building and alleyway holding secrets of a time long gone. It was during one of his evening strolls, an attempt to familiarize himself with his new neighborhood, that Ethan first heard the tale of the dancing lady. Mrs. Green, his elderly neighbor with a penchant for gardening and gossip, spoke of her with a tremor in her voice. "She dances in the moonlight," they say, "luring the curious and the unwary," Mrs. Green had said, her eyes wide and fearful. "A vision of beauty and sorrow, leading the curious to places from which they never return." Ethan, skeptical yet fascinated, thanked Mrs. Green and continued his walk. The tale lingered in his mind, a curious blend of folklore and superstition that seemed out of place in the modern world. He couldn't help but feel drawn to the mystery of it. Several nights later, as Ethan wandered the city's lively streets, the legend of the dancing lady resurfaced in his thoughts. The night was particularly still, with a crescent moon hanging low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the city. That's when he saw her. In a dimly lit street, away from the main thoroughfare, stood a woman. She was dancing alone, her movements fluid and mesmerizing. She twirled and swayed with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. Ethan stopped in his tracks, captivated. The woman's dress, a flowing garment of indistinct color, rippled around her like liquid under the streetlight. Her hair, long and dark, swirled around her as if alive. Ethan felt an inexplicable pull towards her, a desire to see her up close, to understand the allure she held. As he stepped forward, a hand on his shoulder stopped him. He turned to find himself face to face with Mr. Simmons, the neighborhood's unofficial historian and a man known for his knowledge of the city's hidden tales. "You mustn't watch her for too long," Mr. Simmons warned, his voice urgent. "The dancing lady. She's not just a story. I've seen what becomes of those who get too close." Intrigued by Mr. Simmons's earnestness, Ethan invited him to a nearby cafe. Over cups of steaming coffee, Mr. Simmons recounted his own encounter with the dancing lady. Decades ago, he and a friend had seen her. Entranced, his friend had followed her, vanishing into the night, never to be seen again. The dancing lady was no longer just a legend. She was a mystery that tugged at the edges of his reality. He couldn't shake the image of her dance, the way she seemed to exist in a world apart from the one he knew. In the days that followed his encounter with the dancing lady, Ethan found himself drawn to the city's nocturnal heart with an obsession that bordered on compulsion. The sun's descent each evening heralded a transformation within him, an unquenchable thirst for answers that pulled him into the shadows and whispers. The city at night was a different beast entirely. Its modern veneers stripped away to reveal a primal, Gothic skeleton. The moon, a ghostly galleon adrift in the sea of night, cast an eerie pallor over the cobblestone streets. Buildings, once benign in daylight, now loomed like silent sentinels, their windows darkened eyes that followed Ethan's every move. He wandered the streets aimlessly, searching for the ethereal dancer who had so thoroughly ensnared his psyche. The chill in the air was more than the night's embrace. It was an oppressive presence, as if the ghostly echoes of the past clung to the city's ancient bones. One night, under a tapestry of brooding clouds, Ethan's search brought him to an abandoned part of the city, where the buildings were so old they seemed to sag under the weight of their own histories. Here, the silence was deafening, broken only by the distant cry of an owl or the unsettling creak of aging timber. It was in this forgotten quarter that he saw her again, the dancing lady. She appeared suddenly, a specter of moonlight and sorrow, her movements a haunting melody that resonated in the hollow spaces of the night. Ethan's heart leaped, a mix of fear and fascination propelling him forward. As he followed her, the world around him began to warp and twist. Streets narrowed into claustrophobic passageways that wound like serpents, leading him deeper into a darkness that was thick and alive with unseen eyes. The air grew colder, biting into his flesh, as if invisible claws sought to hold him in their icy grasp. Ethan's footsteps echoed hollowly, the sound distorted as though absorbed by the city's ancient stones. The dancing lady's silhouette fluttered at the edge of his vision, always just beyond reach, her dance a macabre waltz that beckoned him to a fate unknown. The buildings around him were no longer mere structures. They pulsed with a malevolent energy, their facades twisted into ghastly visages that leered at him from the darkness. Windows shattered spontaneously, their shards cascading to the ground like tears of broken glass. Doors creaked open, revealing only inky voids that whispered of despair and madness. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind reeling from the nightmarish tableau that unfolded around him. The dancing lady's presence was a potent force, a vortex of dread that drew him inexorably forward. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the cobblestones undulating like the back of some great slumbering beast. Ethan stumbled, his senses assaulted by the stench of decay and the guttural growling that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth. He looked up in horror to see the buildings bending towards him, their structures groaning and cracking as if preparing to collapse. The sky above was a swirling maelstrom of clouds, the moon a baleful eye that watched his torment with cold indifference. The dancing lady's figure grew more indistinct, her form fragmenting into a mist that twisted and writhed like a living thing. Her dance was no longer beautiful. It was a frenetic, jerking motion that spoke of anguish and eternal torment. Ethan realized then that he was not merely a spectator. He was part of the dance, a pawn in a performance that had played out countless times through the centuries. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey, held in thrall by the nightmare that enveloped him. Just when he thought he could endure no more, a voice pierced the darkness. It was a simple, human sound, yet it cut through the terror like a beacon of sanity in a sea of madness. Ethan turned towards the voice, his mind clinging to it as a drowning man clings to a lifeline. Through the chaos, he saw a figure approaching, a lone pedestrian who seemed blissfully unaware of the hellish scene around them. The sight of another living soul broke the spell that held Ethan captive, snapping him back to reality. With a strength born of desperation, he turned and ran, fleeing from the dancing lady and the cursed dance that had almost claimed him. The city's twisted facades melted away, the streets widening and straightening as he put distance between himself and the epicenter of his terror. Ethan didn't stop running until he burst into the relative safety of the city's more populated areas, the sounds of life and civilization washing over him like a cleansing tide. He leaned against a wall, panting, his entire body shaking from the ordeal. As he looked back towards the dark quarter he had fled, Ethan knew he had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The days following Ethan's harrowing escape were marked by a sense of dread that clung to him like a second skin. Sleep eluded him, and when it did come, it was fitful, plagued by nightmares of endless dark streets and the relentless, haunting waltz of the dancing lady. As the sun set on the seventh day, an inexplicable force drew Ethan back to the heart of the city's darkness. A strange resolve settled over him, a need to confront the nightmare that had seeped into his reality. He ventured out, his steps leading him inexorably back to the old quarter of the city where time seemed fractured, where the line between the living and the dead blurred. The streets were deserted, the only sound the mournful howl of the wind as it wound its way through the narrow alleys. The city's ancient buildings stood like tombstones, casting long, forlorn shadows under the wan light of the crescent moon. Ethan's footsteps echoed hollowly on the cobblestones, each step taking him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The air was heavy with an unspoken menace, a sense of impending doom that made his skin crawl. As he walked, the world around him began to warp. Shadows moved of their own volition, coalescing into dark, whispering forms that trailed just out of sight. The air was filled with the stench of decay, a putrid, suffocating odor that seemed to rise from the very stones of the street. Then she appeared. The dancing lady, her form more ghastly than ethereal, her beauty twisted into a distorted parody. Her eyes were hollow pits of despair, her skin pale and translucent, stretched taut over sharp, jutting bones. Her dress, once a flowing garment of shimmering light, was now tattered and stained, clinging to her skeletal frame. Ethan watched in horror as she danced towards him, her movements jerking and unnatural, as if controlled by unseen, malevolent strings. Her mouth opened, a gaping maw that emitted a chilling, discordant melody, a song of death and madness. The world seemed to spin around him, the buildings leaning in, threatening to crush him under their weight. The ground beneath his feet cracked and shifted, opening up into gaping fissures that oozed a thick, black tar. The air was filled with the screams of the damned, a cacophony of terror that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Ethan knew he was witnessing the final act, the culmination of the dancing lady's cursed performance. He could feel her cold, clammy hands reaching for him, pulling him into her dance of death. In a moment of desperate clarity, Ethan realized there was only one way to end the nightmare. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter, a relic from his past, a reminder of a time when the world was simpler, kinder. With trembling hands, he flicked the lighter to life, its flame a beacon of hope in the darkness. He held it aloft, the light casting long, dancing shadows on the cobblestones. The dancing lady recoiled from the flame, her form dissolving into smoke and mist. The buildings righted themselves, the fissures in the ground sealing shut. The screams faded into silence, leaving only the sound of Ethan's ragged breathing. With the last of his strength, Ethan turned and walked away from the nightmare, the lighter held before him like a talisman against the darkness. He didn't look back, knowing that to do so would be to invite the horror back into his life. As he emerged from the old quarter, the city around him returned to normal, the nightmare fading into the recesses of his mind. But Ethan knew it would never truly be gone. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the dance to begin again.